The crowd gathered around the corral like vultures, their laughter cutting through the morning air as Clara Belle knelt beside the collapsed horse. Blood matted its dark coat, and each labored breath seemed like it might be the last. But while everyone else saw a dying animal, Clara saw something different. "You're wasting your time, girl," Silas Ward called out from the fence, his voice dripping with mockery. "That horse ain't worth the bullet it would take to put it out of its misery." The other ranchers nodded in agreement, some chuckling at what they considered Clara's foolish sentiment. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the deep gashes along the horse's flank, likely from barbed wire or a predator attack. The animal's eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a spark that others couldn't see. She had spent every coin she owned to buy this horse from the livestock auction, ignoring the auctioneer's warnings and the crowd's disbelief. "This horse has been through hell," she whispered, running her fingers gently along its neck. The animal's breathing was shallow, its body temperature dropping. Most people would have given up, but Clara had learned long ago that sometimes the most broken things just needed someone to believe in them. Silas leaned against the fence post, shaking his head. "Your father would be rolling in his grave seeing you throw good money after bad. That animal won't last the night, and you'll be left with nothing but regret and an empty purse." The horse tried to lift its head when Clara spoke, its ears twitching at the sound of her voice. She could feel the weight of judgment from every person watching. Their whispered conversations about her poor choices and wasted compassion, but something in the horse's eyes told her to keep fighting. "I've seen plenty of horses in my time," old Pete Miller added from the crowd. "This one's too far gone. You should listen to Silas and cut your losses while you can." Clara stood up slowly, dirt staining her dress, her jaw set with determination. The horse's breathing remained labored, but it hadn't given up yet. Neither would she. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty ground, she made a silent promise to this wounded creature. The crowd began to disperse, convinced they would return tomorrow to find Clara digging a grave. But as they walked away, none of them noticed the subtle change in the horse's breathing, or the way its eyes seemed to focus more clearly on the woman who refused to abandon it. Something was stirring beneath the surface, something that would challenge everything this town thought they knew about hope and healing. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, Clara worked tirelessly beside the horse she had decided to name Thunderheart. She had fashioned a makeshift shelter using old canvas and fence posts, creating shade for the wounded animal. Her water barrel was nearly empty from constantly dampening cloth to cool the horse's fevered body. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," came a sharp voice from behind her. Clara turned to see Martha Henderson, the town's most prominent gossip, standing with her arms crossed. "People are starting to talk, Clara. They're saying you've lost your mind over this worthless animal." Clara dipped the cloth in cool water again, wringing it out before placing it gently on Thunderheart's neck. The horse's breathing had stabilized somewhat, though it remained weak. "Let them talk," she replied quietly, not looking up from her patient. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "Silas Ward is telling everyone you're throwing away your inheritance on a lost cause. He's saying your father would be ashamed of the choices you're making." The mention of her father made Clara's hands pause for just a moment. Her father had taught her to be practical, to make smart decisions with money and resources. But he had also taught her that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the practical thing to do. Thunderheart's ears twitched at the sound of Clara's voice when she began speaking softly to him again. "Easy now," she murmured, checking the bandages she had carefully applied to his wounds. The bleeding had stopped, which was encouraging, but the horse still refused to eat or drink anything she offered. As evening approached, more townspeople gathered at a distance, watching Clara's determined vigil with a mixture of amusement and pity. Some placed bets on how long the horse would survive, while others wagered on when Clara would finally admit defeat and walk away. "That girl's got more stubbornness than sense," she heard one of the ranch hands saying to his companion. "Horse like that ain't worth the effort she's putting in." Clara felt exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she refused to leave Thunderheart's side. She had brought blankets from her cabin and planned to spend the night in the corral, monitoring his condition. The temperature would drop significantly after sunset, and she knew the next few hours would be critical. As darkness began to fall, Thunderheart made his first attempt to lift his head completely off the ground. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, but Clara saw it clearly. Her heart raced with cautious hope, but just as she felt a moment of optimism, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple riders were heading toward the corral, and from their silhouettes against the dying light, Clara could tell they weren't coming with good intentions. Silas Ward dismounted his horse with deliberate slowness, flanked by 3 other men from the town council. Their faces were stern in the flickering light of the lanterns they carried, casting long shadows across the corral where Clara continued her vigil beside Thunderheart. "Clara, this has gone far enough," Silas announced, his voice carrying the authority he believed his position in town afforded him. "You're creating a health hazard keeping a dying animal this close to town. The council has decided that horse needs to be put down tonight." Clara stood up slowly, positioning herself between the men and Thunderheart. Her legs were stiff from hours of kneeling, but her resolve remained unwavering. "This is my property, Silas. You have no right to make decisions about my horse." "That thing isn't a horse anymore," interjected Council Member Frank Morrison, gesturing dismissively toward Thunderheart. "It's a suffering animal that's beyond help. We're trying to do the merciful thing here." Behind them, more townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Clara could hear their murmured conversations, most agreeing with the council's assessment. She felt completely alone, standing against the collective judgment of her entire community. Thunderheart attempted to raise his head again, this time managing to keep it up for several seconds before lowering it back to the ground. The effort was small but noticeable, and Clara took it as a sign that her care was making a difference. "Look at him," she said, pointing to the horse. "He's trying to get better. He lifted his head twice today, and his breathing is stronger than it was this morning." Silas scoffed. "You're seeing what you want to see. Girl, that animal is in pain, and you're prolonging its suffering because you can't accept reality." The tension in the air was thick as Clara faced down the 4 men. She could feel the weight of the entire town's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Everyone expected her to give in, to admit she had made a mistake, to let them end Thunderheart's life. "I'm not moving," Clara stated firmly, crossing her arms. "If you want to harm this horse, you'll have to go through me first." The standoff stretched on for several tense moments. Silas exchanged glances with the other council members, clearly not expecting such fierce resistance. The crowd watched in fascination, some admiring Clara's determination, while others shook their heads at what they considered her foolish stubbornness. Just as Silas opened his mouth to respond, a new sound cut through the night air. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of Thunderheart attempting to whinny. The horse was trying to vocalize, something he hadn't done since Clara brought him home. But the sound that followed immediately after the horse's weak call would change everything anyone thought they knew about this situation. From the darkness beyond the corral came an answering call, the distinctive whinny of another horse. Then another, and another. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by the thunder of hooves against hard-packed earth. Clara's heart raced as she realized what was happening. A small herd of wild horses emerged from the tree line, their eyes reflecting the lantern light as they approached the corral fence. They moved with purpose, not the skittish behavior typical of wild animals near humans. The lead mare, a magnificent chestnut with a white blaze, stopped just outside the fence and whinnied again toward Thunderheart. "Well, I'll be," whispered old Pete Miller from the crowd. "Never seen wild horses come this close to town before, especially not with all these people around." Silas and his council members stood frozen, unsure how to react to this unexpected development. The wild horses showed no fear of the gathered humans, their attention focused entirely on the wounded horse lying in the corral. Thunderheart responded with another weak but determined call. Clara watched in amazement as the lead mare began pacing along the fence line, never taking her eyes off Thunderheart. 2 younger horses flanked her, and a powerful stallion brought up the rear of the small group. Their behavior was unlike anything anyone in the crowd had ever witnessed. "They know him," Clara breathed, the realization hitting her like lightning. Thunderheart isn't just any horse. He was part of their herd. The implications of this discovery rippled through the assembled townspeople. Murmurs of recognition and understanding began replacing the earlier mockery and doubt. If Thunderheart had been a member of this wild herd, then his value and significance were far greater than anyone had imagined. Silas tried to regain control of the situation. "This doesn't change anything," he declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Wild or not, that horse is still dying, and these animals will move on once they realize there's nothing they can do." But the wild horses showed no signs of leaving. Instead, the lead mare moved closer to the fence, stretching her neck toward Thunderheart and nickering softly. The wounded horse responded by making his most sustained effort yet to lift his head, managing to keep it raised for nearly a full minute. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she watched the interaction between Thunderheart and his former family. The connection between the animals was undeniable, and their presence seemed to be giving Thunderheart strength he hadn't shown before. "Look at him," she said to the crowd, her voice filled with emotion. "He's fighting harder now that they're here. He's not ready to give up." The standoff between Clara and the town council had transformed into something entirely different. Now it wasn't just about one woman's determination to save a dying horse. It was about respecting the bonds between creatures that most humans couldn't fully understand. As the night deepened, the wild horses settled into a protective circle around the corral, showing no intention of abandoning their wounded family member. But their presence would bring consequences that none of them could have anticipated. Dawn broke slowly over the town, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Clara had spent the entire night beside Thunderheart, dozing fitfully against the corral fence while the wild horses maintained their vigil outside. The stallion had positioned himself as a sentinel, while the mares took turns approaching the fence to check on their wounded companion. As the first rays of sunlight touched the corral, Clara noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Thunderheart was attempting to stand. His front legs trembled with the effort, and his breathing was labored, but the determination in his movements was unmistakable. "Easy, boy," Clara whispered, moving to his side. She didn't try to help him or interfere with his struggle, understanding instinctively that this was something he needed to do on his own. The wild horses outside the fence had grown quiet, watching intently as their former herd member fought to regain his footing. The sound of approaching footsteps made Clara look up. Early risers from town were beginning to gather, word having spread throughout the night about the wild horses that had appeared. Among them was Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's veterinarian, carrying his medical bag. "I heard about what happened last night," Dr. Hayes said quietly, setting his bag down near the fence. "Thought I should take a look at that horse, see if there's anything medical I can do to help." Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly doctor. Unlike others in town, he had come to offer assistance rather than judgment. As he examined Thunderheart's wounds and checked his vital signs, the horse remained remarkably calm, as if he understood that help was being offered. "The wounds are healing better than I expected," Dr. Hayes announced after his examination. "No signs of infection, and his temperature is nearly normal. Whatever you've been doing, Clara, it's working." Silas Ward appeared at the fence, his expression grim. "Doctor, surely you can see that animal is suffering. The humane thing would be to put it out of its misery." Dr. Hayes stood up slowly, fixing Silas with a steady gaze. "In my professional opinion, this horse is not suffering. He's recovering. Slowly, but recovering nonetheless. I see no medical reason to end his life." The crowd that had gathered murmured in surprise at the doctor's assessment. Clara felt vindicated, but she knew the real test was still ahead. Thunderheart had managed to get his front legs under him, but rising completely would require strength he might not yet possess. As if responding to the collective attention focused on him, Thunderheart made another determined effort. This time, with a grunt of exertion that echoed across the silent corral, he managed to lift his hindquarters off the ground. For the first time since Clara had brought him home, Thunderheart was standing upright, though shakily. The wild horses outside the fence whinnied in what sounded like celebration, and even some of the skeptical townspeople began to murmur words of amazement. But Clara knew that standing was only the beginning. The real challenge would be whether Thunderheart could take his first steps toward full recovery. Thunderheart swayed slightly on his legs, but remained upright. Clara held her breath, afraid that any sudden movement might cause him to collapse again. The entire crowd had fallen silent, watching this moment that would determine whether Clara's faith had been justified or misplaced. Dr. Hayes stepped closer, observing the horse's posture and balance. "His stance is weak, but stable," he said in a low voice. "The fact that he's bearing weight on all four legs is remarkable considering his condition yesterday." Silas Ward's expression had shifted from smugness to uncertainty. He had been so confident that the horse would die during the night, and now he found himself watching an animal that appeared to be defying his predictions. "Standing doesn't mean he's recovered," he muttered defensively. "Horse could still collapse any moment." The lead mare from the wild herd approached the fence again, stretching her neck toward Thunderheart and nickering softly. The wounded horse turned his head toward her voice, and Clara could see recognition in his eyes. Whatever bond existed between these animals was providing him with motivation that human care alone couldn't offer. Martha Henderson pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with excitement. "Clara, dear, I owe you an apology," she said breathlessly. "I thought you were being foolish, but seeing this, well, it's quite something." Clara nodded graciously, though her attention remained focused on Thunderheart. She could see him testing his weight distribution, shifting slightly from one leg to another as if remembering how to balance properly. Each small movement was progress, but she knew he was still far from being truly well. "Water," Dr. Hayes suggested. "If he's strong enough to stand, he might be ready to drink. Dehydration has been one of my biggest concerns." Clara carefully brought a bucket of fresh water within Thunderheart's reach. The horse lowered his head cautiously, sniffing the water before taking his first tentative sips. The crowd watched in fascination as he drank slowly but steadily, the first sustenance he had accepted since Clara brought him home. As Thunderheart continued drinking, the wild stallion outside the fence began pacing with increasing agitation. His behavior caught Clara's attention, and she noticed his ears were pointed toward the road leading into town. Something was approaching that had put the wild horses on alert. The sound of multiple wagons and riders became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder. Clara felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach as she recognized the voices and the distinctive sound of iron wheels on hard-packed earth. The territorial marshal was arriving with a small convoy, and from the aggressive tone of the approaching voices, they weren't coming to celebrate Thunderheart's recovery. Somebody must have sent word to the marshal about the wild horses, Dr. Hayes said grimly. They probably reported them as a threat to the town. Clara's heart sank as she realized the implications. The marshal would likely order the wild horses driven away, and Thunderheart was still too weak to travel with them. But separating him from his herd now, just when their presence was clearly helping his recovery, could undo all the progress they had made. The approaching convoy was only minutes away, and Clara had to make a choice that would determine not only Thunderheart's fate, but the future of the entire wild herd that had risked everything to be near their wounded family member. Marshal Thomas Crawford rode into the town square with 6 armed deputies, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they approached the corral. Clara could see the determination in his weathered face and knew that reasoning with him would be difficult. The marshal had a reputation for swift, decisive action, especially when it came to what he perceived as threats to settled communities. "I received reports of wild horses threatening this town," Marshal Crawford announced loudly, dismounting near the corral. "Where I come from, we don't let dangerous animals endanger decent folk." Clara stepped forward, her hands raised peacefully. "Marshal, these horses aren't threatening anyone. They're here because of him," she said, gesturing toward Thunderheart, who still stood shakily but steadily in the corral. The marshal's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. The wild horses had formed a loose circle around the corral, but they showed no signs of aggression. Their attention remained focused on Thunderheart, and they moved aside calmly as the marshal's men positioned themselves around the area. Dr. Hayes approached the marshal with his medical bag in hand. "Marshal Crawford, I'm the town veterinarian. These animals pose no threat. They're simply responding to a natural instinct to care for an injured member of their herd. Natural or not, wild horses this close to town create problems," the marshal replied curtly. "Ranchers lose livestock, crops get trampled, and people get hurt. My job is to prevent those problems before they start." Silas Ward seized the opportunity to reassert his position. "Marshal, we've been trying to resolve this situation all night. That wounded horse should be put down, and these wild ones need to be driven back where they came from." But before the marshal could respond, something unexpected happened. Thunderheart took his first tentative step forward, then another. The effort was clearly exhausting, but his determination was unmistakable. He was walking toward the corral gate, toward the wild horses that had waited patiently for him throughout the long night. The crowd watched in amazement as Thunderheart continued his slow but steady progress across the corral. Each step was deliberate and measured, and though he moved carefully, there was no mistaking the strength returning to his movements. "I'll be damned," muttered one of the deputies. "Horse looks like he's getting ready to leave on his own." Clara felt her heart breaking as she realized what was happening. Thunderheart was choosing to rejoin his herd, even though he was still weak and vulnerable. The bond between him and the wild horses was stronger than his need for her continued care. Marshal Crawford watched the scene unfold with growing interest. "Seems like nature might be solving this problem for us," he said thoughtfully. "Question is, can that horse actually make it with the herd, or is this just going to end in tragedy somewhere out on the range?" The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present understood that what happened next would determine the fate of both Thunderheart and the wild horses who had risked everything to be near him. Thunderheart reached the corral gate, his breathing heavy but controlled. Clara moved quickly to unlatch it, her hands trembling with emotion as she realized this might be the last time she would see the horse she had fought so hard to save. The gate swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the silent gathering. The lead mare stepped forward immediately, touching noses with Thunderheart in a gesture of welcome and recognition. The other wild horses moved closer, forming a protective circle around their recovering family member. Clara could see the relief in their posture as they prepared to welcome him back into the herd. "Wait!" Dr. Hayes called out, approaching with his medical bag. "Let me check his condition one more time before they leave." The veterinarian conducted a quick but thorough examination while the wild horses waited patiently. Thunderheart stood calmly during the process, as if he understood the importance of this final assessment. "His wounds are healing well, and his vital signs are stable," Dr. Hayes announced to the assembled crowd. "He's weak, but if the herd travels slowly and stays near water sources, he should continue to recover." Marshal Crawford nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "In all my years, I've never seen wild horses behave like this." They waited all night for him, knowing full well they were risking their own safety by staying so close to town. Clara approached Thunderheart one last time, placing her hand gently on his neck. "You fought hard, boy," she whispered. "Now go live the life you were meant to live." The horse turned his head toward her, and for a moment, their eyes met in what felt like a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared. Then, with careful but determined steps, Thunderheart walked through the gate to rejoin his herd. The wild horses formed a protective formation around him, with the strongest animals flanking his sides and the lead mare taking point. As they began to move away from the corral, their pace was deliberately slow, accommodating Thunderheart's still recovering strength. The entire town watched in respectful silence as the herd departed, understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Even Silas Ward stood quietly, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging admiration for what Clara had accomplished. "You saved his life," Martha Henderson said softly, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Everyone can see that now." Clara wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the herd disappear into the morning mist. "No," she replied, her voice filled with quiet pride. "I just gave him a chance to save himself." Marshal Crawford approached Clara as the last of the wild horses vanished from sight. "Ma'am, what you did here took real courage. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to fight and when to let go." As the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained at the corral fence, watching the empty horizon where Thunderheart and his family had disappeared. She had lost the horse she had grown to love, but she had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that compassion and determination could triumph over doubt and criticism. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the earth and promising a new day filled with possibilities. Clara smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, Thunderheart was running free with his herd, stronger because someone had refused to give up on him when everyone else had lost hope. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
A weary police officer was finishing his shift on a rainy New York evening when a ragged German shepherd emerged from the shadows, carrying half a soggy bagel in its mouth and dropping it gently at his feet. The dog had no collar, no home, and eyes that told stories of battles fought in silence. But, as the officer bent down, he noticed something. A faint tattoo in the dog's ear, the kind only used for trained canines. That simple mark would unravel a case long buried, a missing security guard no one had searched for in months, and a web of corruption that reached the highest floors of the city's glass towers. And, at the heart of it all, was this dog, who had guarded a deadly secret in the dark for almost a year. The rain in New York that evening was the kind that didn't just fall, it clung. Thin sheets of water slid down the glassy walls of midtown skyscrapers, pooling at the curbs where the neon lights fractured into trembling puddles. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, wet concrete, and something burnt from a food cart down the block. Traffic hummed like a restless animal in the distance. But on this side street, life moved slower, muffled by the steady patter from the sky. Jake Turner sat on a wooden bench beneath a flickering street lamp. The brim of his police cap pulled low, though it did little to keep the rain from running down his face. Jake was 36, broad-shouldered, with the solid, built-for-work frame of someone who had spent years on patrol. His uniform was still damp from the earlier chase dark navy shirt clinging to him, the faint scent of gun oil and rain mingling. A faint scar ran across his jawline, the result of a knife fight in an alley 5 years back. Normally, Jake had an easy, dependable air about him, the kind that made neighbors wave and kids in the block feel safe. But tonight, his eyes were clouded, the lines at the corners deeper than usual. He'd failed. The boy had been right there. Jake could still see the terrified eyes, the bound wrists before the unmarked van sped away into the maze of traffic. Every officer had days that left a mark. This one had carved something heavier into Jake's chest. He didn't care about the soaking rain. He didn't care about the cold that was settling into his bones. He sat there because he didn't want to go home yet, not with that failure echoing in his head. From the far side of the street, something moved a shadow that didn't belong to the sluggish pedestrians. It was low to the ground, weaving between trash cans and puddles. Then it stopped, watching him. The figure stepped into the glow of the street lamp, and Jake's brows drew together. It was a German shepherd, though at first glance he looked like the kind of stray the city had long forgotten. His fur, once the proud mix of deep sable and tan, was clumped and dull, heavy with rain. His ribs showed under the coat, and his left ear had a notch in it, the kind that came from an old fight. Mud streaked his legs, and there was a faint limp to his back right paw, but his eyes, amber, sharp, were alive. In his mouth, the dog carried half of a soggy bagel, torn and uneven, the kind you'd pull from a trash bag behind a deli. Slowly, the shepherd walked up to Jake, dropped the bagel at his boots, and stepped back, tail wagging once, hesitantly. Jake blinked, caught off guard. "You bringing me dinner?" His voice was rough from the day, but there was a faint upward twitch to his mouth. A middle-aged man pushing a cart of pretzels along the sidewalk slowed, shook his head at the sight. "That mutt's been hanging around here for months," he muttered, barely glancing at Jake before continuing down the block. A woman in a red coat skirted wide around the dog, casting a look of mild disgust before hurrying on. Jake reached down slowly, palm open. The shepherd sniffed, then pressed his cold, damp nose into Jake's hand. Up close, Jake could see the dog wasn't just hungry, he was exhausted. And yet, there was something steady in the way he stood, like he'd been through worse and decided to survive anyway. "What's your story, huh?" Jake murmured. He scanned for a collar, nothing. No tag, no scraps of leather, just matted fur and that faint smell of wet earth. The shepherd sat down beside him without being told, body pressed lightly to Jake's leg as though claiming his spot. The rain continued to fall, each drop tapping on Jake's cap, running down the brim. Jake didn't move away. Minutes passed like that. Two living beings, strangers and yet not, sharing a patch of light in the rain. Jake could hear the pretzel cart's squeaky wheels fading, the hiss of passing tires, the occasional horn far off, but mostly he heard his own breathing and the steady, quiet presence of the animal beside him. "All right, buddy," Jake finally said, leaning forward. "You look like you could use a roof. And maybe, so could I." The shepherd tilted his head as if weighing the offer. Then, with a decisive motion, he stood and nudged Jake's knee with his nose. It wasn't a bark, wasn't a whine, just a gesture, a choice. Jake rose from the bench, his boots splashing in the shallow water along the curb. Together, they began walking down the narrow side street toward the direction of the station. The rain was still coming down, but for the first time all day, Jake didn't feel like it was only falling on him. The walk back toward the precinct was slow, more because Jake found himself studying the dog than because of the weather. The rain had eased into a fine mist soft enough to blur the glow of the streetlights and smear the neon signs into watercolor smudges. Ranger trotted slightly ahead, the pads of his paws making barely a sound on the wet pavement, but every so often he'd glance back, checking if Jake was still behind. Without the curtain of rain, Jake could see him more clearly now. This was no ordinary street stray. The muscles in his shoulders moved with a certain precision, the kind you only saw in trained working dogs. His tail didn't wag much, but it didn't droop either. It was held low, steady, purposeful. And then there was the scar, a thin, pale ring of hairless skin around his neck, like he'd once worn something too tight, too long. As they reached the next block, the skyline opened slightly, revealing the steel and glass face of the Dawson Corporate Tower, a 30-story office building whose reflective windows were black now except for a few glowing floors. Jake's steps slowed when he realized Ranger had stopped completely. The shepherd's ears were rigid, eyes locked on the tower as if every nerve in his body was tuned to it. Then came the sound, a low, almost inaudible growl, the kind a dog makes when he knows something is wrong but hasn't decided if it's time to act. Jake glanced at the building. He knew it. The precinct had been called there more than once for break-ins or corporate disputes, but nothing major. He made a mental note. "What's your problem with that place, huh?" he asked quietly. Ranger didn't look at him, didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the tower, lips barely parted over his teeth. A cough from the shadows pulled Jake's attention. A man was sitting on the low stone wall by the entrance to an alley, hunched under a tattered army jacket that might have been olive green once but was now closer to mud brown. He was in his late 50s, with a weathered face, thick gray beard, and skin creased from years of cold nights. A knitted cap covered most of his hair, and his eyes were the pale, watery blue of someone who'd seen too much. "You with that dog?" the man rasped, jerking his chin toward Ranger. His voice had the gravelly edge of a long-term cigarette use. Jake stepped closer. "You know him?" The man nodded slowly. "Seen him round for months. Don't belong to no one, but he's no regular stray. Hangs around here, always circling the block, never begging for food, like he's watching something." Jake's cop instincts kicked in. "Always around this building?" "Yeah," the man said, scratching his beard. "Mostly after dark. Sometimes he disappears for a day or two, then comes back. Saw him once trying to get through the loading dock gate, barking like he'd seen the devil himself." The man gave Ranger a sidelong look. "Smart one, too. Won't let just anyone near him. You must be something special if he's sticking with you." Jake crouched to meet Ranger's eyes. "You've been hanging around here for a reason, haven't you?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but his stare felt like it carried more than instinct, it carried intent. The homeless man shifted his jacket tighter around him. "Name's Walter Briggs, by the way. Used to do maintenance work before the company folded. Bad back, bad luck, and here I am." There was no self-pity in his tone, just a blunt statement of fact. Jake respected that. "All right, Walter," Jake said, slipping a few bills from his pocket. "Get yourself something warm, and if you see this dog near the building again, let me know." He pulled a small notepad from his jacket and scribbled his cell number. Walter took the paper with a nod. "Will do, officer." "Turner, Jake Turner." "Turner," Walter repeated as if testing the name in his mouth. "You keep that one close. Dogs like him, they know things." Jake gave him a short salute before Ranger finally broke his vigil and followed. But as they passed the Dawson Tower, Jake noticed the dog's head tilt slightly, ears flicking at a sound too faint for him to catch. It was only for a second. Then Ranger moved on, paws splashing lightly in the shallow water by the curb. By the time they reached the precinct, the mist had settled into the kind of chill that seeped through uniform fabric. Jake glanced down at the shepherd, still no collar, no tags, but definitely not lost in the way most strays were. This dog belonged somewhere once, and whatever had taken him from that place had left a mark deeper than the scar on his neck. He thought about the growl at the sight of the Dawson Tower, about Walter's words, about the idea of a dog patrolling a building like a ghost guard, returning again and again for months. It wasn't random. Something in that building, or someone connected to it, had crossed paths with Ranger before. Inside the station, fluorescent lights replaced the soft glow of the street lamps. Jake led Ranger to a quiet corner near his desk, dropping an old blanket on the floor. The dog circled it once before lying down, his body curling but his eyes still watchful. Even here, in the supposed safety of the precinct, Ranger's gaze kept shifting toward the front door every time it opened. Jake sat down heavily, water dripping from his jacket onto the linoleum. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the precinct's incident logs for Dawson Tower. Nothing in the last month. A few trespassing calls before that. A break-in at the loading dock nearly 8 months ago, reported by a security guard named Janet Miller. Jake frowned. That name tugged at something in his memory, but it didn't surface yet. He looked at Ranger again. "We're gonna figure this out, partner," he said under his breath. The dog's ears twitched at the word partner, and for a moment Jake could swear there was recognition in those amber eyes. By the time Jake closed the precinct's heavy glass door behind them, the mist outside had thickened into a clingy drizzle, the kind that soaked through collars and crept under jackets. The warm, recycled air of the lobby met them like a weak embrace. Ranger shook himself once, sending a spray of water across the linoleum, then stood still, amber eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. The night desk officer, Sergeant Linda McCauley, glanced up from her paperwork. Linda was in her mid-40s, with a compact square build and short-cropped auburn hair that had begun to silver at the temples. She had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 2 decades in uniform, but Jake knew her as fair and fiercely protective of her colleagues. She raised an eyebrow at the dripping shepherd. "Stray or evidence?" she asked in her dry, gravel-edged voice. "Something in between," Jake replied, removing his cap. "Found him out in the rain. I'll get him cleaned up before anyone complains about the smell." Linda smirked faintly, but her eyes softened as they followed Ranger's cautious movements. "Watch yourself, Turner. Strays have a way of sticking." Jake led Ranger through the side hall toward the locker room, where a small utility sink and hose made an impromptu wash station. He knelt to check the dog over more carefully under the bright fluorescent lights. Up close, Ranger's fur was a patchwork of matted clumps and dried mud. Jake filled a bucket with warm water, grabbed an old bottle of mild soap someone had left behind, and started working the suds into the shepherd's coat. Ranger didn't flinch at the touch, but his eyes never stopped moving, tracking every sound, the creak of a locker door, the muffled laugh from the squad room, the distant ring of a phone. Jake recognized that hyper-awareness. He'd seen it in combat veterans and certain cops after bad calls. "You've been somewhere rough, haven't you?" Jake murmured, rinsing the soap away. As he lifted Ranger's left ear to clean it, something caught his attention, a faint tattoo, barely visible under the damp fur. He tilted the ear forward, reading the small string of letters and numbers etched into the skin. It was precise, official-looking, not the work of a casual owner. Jake knew enough about canine units to recognize it for what it was, a registration code used for canine dogs in private security or military contracts. "That explains a few things," he muttered, drying Ranger with a worn towel. The shepherd endured the process with stoic patience, shaking only once when Jake loosened his grip. Once dry, Jake took him to the break room, where the hum of the vending machine and the faint scent of stale coffee lingered. From a cupboard, Jake pulled out a spare metal food bowl and filled it with kibble from the small stash kept for the precinct's occasional use with police dogs. Ranger approached, sniffed, and began to eat, but slowly, each mouthful chewed with deliberate care. Between bites, he would pause, lift his head, and scan the room again, ears swiveling toward every noise. Linda stepped in briefly to refill her coffee. She gave a low whistle. "He's disciplined. Doesn't wolf it down like most strays." Jake nodded. Someone trained him. And judging by that scar on his neck, someone also didn't treat him right. Linda frowned, blowing on her coffee. Private security outfits sometimes dump their dogs when they're done with them. Costs money to feed and keep them. Not all follow the rules about retirement placements. She hesitated, then added, "Some dogs disappear after their handlers do." Jake let that sit in his mind. The name from the Dawson Tower report. Janet Miller nudged at the edge of his memory again, but he pushed it aside for now. Instead, he crouched next to Ranger, scratching lightly behind the ears. "We're going to get you checked out, buddy. See what your story is." When Ranger finished eating, Jake laid a folded blanket near his desk, a spot away from the drafty windows, but close enough to keep the dog within sight. Ranger circled twice before settling down, head on his paws, eyes still open. Jake sat, logging into his terminal. He keyed in the code from Ranger's ear into the National Canine Registry database. The screen took a long moment before loading the result. Iron Shield Protective Services. The record was sparse, listing the dog as male, German Shepherd, age 6, trained in patrol and scent detection. Handler of record, Miller, Janet. Status, deceased. Jake's brow furrowed. If the dog was here, alive, then either the record was wrong, or someone had marked him dead for a reason. And if Janet Miller was also missing, as the old report suggested, then Ranger might be the only living witness to whatever happened. He leaned back, eyes on the dog. "You and I are going to have a long conversation," he said softly. Ranger's ear flicked in his direction, but he didn't move, just watched. Outside, the rain began to lighten, the sound against the windows turning to a faint patter. Inside, the hum of the precinct settled into its nighttime rhythm. Jake stayed at his desk longer than planned, alternating between watching Ranger and scanning through old case files linked to Iron Shield. The dog didn't sleep, not really. His breathing stayed steady, but his gaze kept shifting, as if he were still on duty. Jake recognized that kind of vigilance. It meant that whatever had happened to this dog, he wasn't ready to stand down. Not yet. The precinct's overhead lights cast a cold, even glow across Jake's desk as the cursor blinked on the search screen. The database entry for Iron Shield Protective Services, Handler, Miller, Janet, sat open in front of him, that word deceased glaring at him like a bad joke. Jake's gut told him it was wrong. He keyed in a deeper search through the NYPD archives, pulling up case files connected to Janet Miller. The system took its time, the spinning wheel on the screen a silent reminder that police tech always lagged behind the private sector. Finally, a list of reports appeared. Most were routine security logs from corporate buildings, but one, dated 8 months ago, stood out. It was flagged, Incident Report, Priority, but marked, Closed, No Further Action. That alone raised suspicion. Jake clicked it open. The report was filed from Dawson Corporate Tower, the same building Ranger had reacted to earlier. It described a security disturbance involving unknown persons accessing the restricted executive level. Janet Miller was listed as the reporting party. Her description: female, 32, average height, athletic build, dark hair usually tied back matched the kind of profile Jake associated with disciplined security personnel. A photo was attached. A woman with serious brown eyes, a faint smile that looked like it took effort, wearing a dark blazer over a tactical polo. In the report's narrative, Janet claimed she had overheard conversations between senior executives and external contractors about financial transfers inconsistent with corporate policy. Jake didn't need a translator. Those were careful words for money laundering. Then, halfway down the report, it just stopped. The last sentence trailed off mid-word. The remaining pages were blank except for an internal note. Handler unavailable for follow-up. Jake frowned. He'd seen this before, cases abruptly closed when they brushed too close to powerful interests. His desk phone rang, a sharp sound in the quiet. He picked it up. "Turner?" "Jake. It's Samantha Ortiz from Records," came the voice on the other end. Samantha was in her late 20s, with a quick wit and a sharper memory, the kind of clerk who could find a file in a mile-high stack without looking. She was petite, with black hair cut in a blunt bob and an ever-present pair of tortoiseshell glasses. "You asked me to pull building security footage from Dawson Tower the night of that disturbance. I found something." Jake sat up. "Go on." "There's a gap," Samantha said. "Camera feeds from the executive floor cut out for 32 minutes. But in the loading dock feed different system, there's this." A new email alert pinged on Jake's screen. He opened the attached clip. The grainy black and white footage showed the loading dock entrance, time-stamped the same night, at 11:43 p.m. A ranger appeared in frame, fur still fuller than now, trotting determinedly out of the service elevator. Clenched in his jaws was a heavy canvas backpack. He paused at the edge of the dock, ears pricked, then disappeared into the shadows beyond the frame. Jake's throat tightened. Ranger hadn't just been there, he'd left with something. "You see anyone with him?" Jake asked. "No," Samantha replied, "but about 15 minutes earlier, Janet Miller swiped into the building on her keycard. She never swiped out. That's the last record of her." Jake leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And the file says she's missing?" Samantha hesitated. "Officially? No. Officially, she's listed as having resigned without notice, but you and I both know that's not the whole story." He thanked her and hung up, eyes going to the dog curled on the blanket by his desk. Ranger was half dozing, but one eye remained open, tracking Jake's movement. Jake pulled the evidence form template onto his screen, starting to jot down what he had. Ranger's presence at Dawson Tower on the night Janet vanished, carrying a backpack. Janet's involvement in a possible money laundering case, the sudden closure of her report. He stopped short of filing it officially. Too many cases like this had a way of disappearing when entered into the main system. For now, it would stay in his personal notes. He crouched beside Ranger. "That night, you saw something, didn't you? Maybe you were even trying to protect her." The dog didn't react much, just a slow blink, but his tail thumped once against the blanket. The pieces were aligning, but the picture was still incomplete. Janet Miller had stumbled onto something dangerous, filed a report that was buried, and vanished the same night her dog carried a mystery backpack out of the building. That wasn't coincidence, that was cause and effect. As Jake stood, Linda McCauley passed by, slipping her coat on. "Burning the midnight oil again?" she asked. "Something like that," he replied. She glanced at Ranger. "That one's been places. If only they could talk, huh?" Jake managed a tight smile. "Yeah, if only." Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the city lights. Inside, Jake's mind was moving faster than it had all week. Ranger wasn't just a stray who'd wandered into his life, he was the living link to a missing witness and a crime that someone had worked very hard to bury. It was close to midnight when Jake decided he'd had enough of staring at his screen. The image of Ranger on that grainy loading dock footage kept replaying in his head, the determined gait, the heavy backpack clenched in his jaws, and the way he vanished into darkness. Something in that movement spoke of purpose, of a destination the dog already knew. Ranger lay on the blanket, eyes half shut but still following Jake's every move. "All right, partner," Jake said quietly. "Let's see where you were going that night." He clipped on a makeshift leash from a spare length of rope and opened the precinct's side door to the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, save for the occasional rumble of a delivery truck or the faint siren wailing blocks away. Ranger led immediately, his body posture shifting from relaxed to alert. His nose hovered inches from the ground, tail low and straight, every muscle attuned to a scent trail only he could read. They moved through a few blocks of worn brick buildings and shuttered storefronts until the streetlights grew sparse and the air took on the damp, mineral tang of the riverfront. They came to a fenced-off construction site, the chain link bent inward at one corner, just enough for a determined dog to squeeze through. Jake followed, his boots crunching over loose gravel. Ranger's pace quickened as they crossed the site, weaving between stacks of concrete forms and rusted scaffolding. At the far edge, partially concealed by a collapsed section of corrugated metal, was a dark opening. Jake crouched to shine his flashlight inside. A service tunnel, the walls lined with old brick slick from condensation. Ranger didn't hesitate. He slipped inside, paws silent on the damp floor. Jake ducked in after him, the smell of mold and rust thick in the air. The tunnel stretched about 20 yards before widening into a low chamber. Ranger stopped at a pile of wooden crates pushed against the wall. He began pawing and nosing at the base until Jake knelt beside him and pulled one crate aside. Behind it, hidden in a recess of crumbling brick, was a weathered canvas backpack. Jake eased it out, the straps stiff with dried mud. He unzipped it and pulled out a thick, spiral-bound notebook wrapped in a plastic grocery bag for protection. Inside, the pages were filled with dense handwriting dates, times, and short descriptions written in block letters. He flipped through. April 12th. Hale met with unknown male, Eastern European accent, discussed offshore accounts. May 6th. Mention of laundering funds through shell companies registered in Nevada. June 19th. Threat made to dispose of a potential leak. Jake's stomach tightened. Hale, Victoria, Hale, the COO of Dawson Towers' parent company. This wasn't just petty theft or minor corporate fraud. This was organized, deliberate, and dangerous. A faint sound from deeper in the tunnel made him freeze. Ranger's head snapped up, ears forward, body rigid. The low, warning growl that came from his chest was enough to make the hairs on Jake's arms stand up. He turned off his flashlight, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The sound came again, a soft scrape of something against stone. They waited, motionless. After a moment, the noise faded. Ranger didn't relax until another minute passed. Jake exhaled slowly, then zipped the backpack shut and slung it over his shoulder. "Let's get this to the car," he whispered. The trip back through the tunnel was faster. Ranger kept glancing behind them as though expecting someone or something to follow. When they emerged into the construction site, Jake paused to scan the area before slipping back onto the street. By the time they returned to the precinct, Jake's clothes were damp with tunnel grime, and the notebook felt like it weighed more than paper should. He set the backpack on his desk and pulled out his phone. The first person he needed to call was someone who could handle this kind of evidence without it vanishing into the bureaucratic void. But for now, he crouched and rested a hand on Ranger's head. "You've been guarding this all along, haven't you? Making sure it didn't end up in the wrong hands." The dog blinked slowly, tail giving a single thump against the floor. Jake knew they'd just taken the first real step toward finding Janet Miller and toward exposing whatever Victoria Hale had been hiding. The following morning, Jake sat in the cramped conference room on the third floor of the precinct, a coffee cooling in front of him and the worn canvas backpack sitting on the table like a silent witness. Across from him was Special Agent Marcus Hale, no relation to Victoria of the FBI's New York field office. Marcus was in his early 40s, tall and wiry, with a clean-shaven head and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything he saw. He carried himself with the ease of someone used to walking into dangerous situations with a plan already formed. Jake laid out the notebook, careful not to smudge the plastic gloves he wore. "You'll want to go through this page by page. It's all from Janet Miller. Times, dates, meetings, money transfers, threats, enough to bury Victoria Hale if we can tie it together." Marcus flipped through, his expression tightening as he read. "We've had whispers about her for years, but nothing concrete. This—" He tapped the notebook with a gloved finger. "This could change everything." The door creaked open, and Agent Dana Collier stepped in, carrying a laptop and a stack of manila folders. Dana was in her mid-30s, with a runner's build, curly auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and an energy that filled the room even before she spoke. She was known for being relentless once she had a lead, a trait shaped by her early years working missing persons cases. She set the laptop down. "We cross-referenced the dates in the notebook with our surveillance logs. At least 4 of the meetings matched times we saw known financial crime figures in the city guys tied to Eastern European syndicates." She glanced at Ranger, who lay under the table, head resting on his paws but eyes tracking every movement. "And that's the dog from the video?" "Ranger," Jake confirmed. "He was Janet's partner, been guarding that notebook for 8 months." Dana crouched briefly to offer her hand. Ranger sniffed it, then gave a short wag of his tail. "Good instincts," she murmured. Over the next hour, the 4 of them hashed out a plan. The FBI would take the lead on the financial investigation, tracing the offshore accounts and shell companies mentioned in Janet's notes. Jake's role would be closer to the ground watching Victoria's movements, looking for an opening to catch her in possession of incriminating materials or in contact with her criminal partners. By midday, Jake and Ranger were back on the street. The October air carried a sharp bite, and leaves skittered across the sidewalks. Ranger walked at Jake's side, ears swiveling, eyes constantly scanning. Twice, Jake caught him glancing over his shoulder at a black SUV that seemed to be taking the same turns they did. The third time, Ranger gave a low, rumbling growl. Jake crossed the street abruptly, ducking into a side alley to see if the SUV followed. It passed by without slowing, but Ranger kept watching until it disappeared. "You don't miss much, do you?" Jake said, giving him a quick scratch between the ears. That afternoon, they stopped by the department's canine training yard, partly for exercise, partly to keep Ranger's senses sharp. A few off-duty officers were there, including Officer Ben Ramirez, a stocky, good-natured cop with a shaved head and a booming laugh. Ben had his 6-year-old daughter Sophia with him, a shy girl with dark pigtails and a pink hoodie. While Jake and Ben talked shop, Sophia wandered toward Ranger, holding a bright red ball. Ranger's posture softened instantly. He lowered his head, tail wagging gently, and when she tossed the ball clumsily, he trotted over, picked it up with careful precision, and brought it back, placing it softly in her small hands. Ben chuckled. "Guess he's got a soft spot for kids." "Yeah," Jake said, watching the scene. "Or maybe he just knows who the good ones are." When a loud clang echoed from the far side of the yard, someone dropping a metal gate. Ranger moved instinctively, stepping in front of Sophia, body stiff until he identified the source of the noise. Only when the tension left his frame did he return to the game. By early evening, Jake was back in his unmarked car, parked within sight of Dawson Tower. He and Marcus had agreed this would be his sector close enough to watch for patterns, far enough to avoid spooking Victoria. Ranger sat in the back seat, nose near the half-open window, ears catching every sound. Twice he gave a sharp bark at pedestrians who lingered too long near the building's side entrance. Jake jotted down the times, noting the stranger's clothing and direction of travel. One of them, a tall man in a tailored navy coat, ducked inside after a brief phone call. Something about the man's furtive glance toward the street stuck with Jake. He checked the time, 7:42 p.m., another entry for Marcus's files. When they finally pulled away for the night, the streets were quieter, the city settling into its nocturnal hum. Jake reached back to pat Ranger's shoulder. "Good work today, partner. We'll get her. Just takes patience." Ranger met his eyes in the rearview mirror, and Jake felt that familiar certainty again. This dog wasn't just along for the ride. He was part of the hunt. The morning of the board meeting broke clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day where the air felt sharp enough to cut. Jake arrived early at Dawson Corporate Tower, dressed not in his uniform but in a charcoal gray suit that hid his service pistol beneath the jacket. Ranger walked at his side on a short leather lead, his coat brushed clean, ears alert, and a faint glint in those amber eyes. To most people, he would look like a well-trained K-9 escorting an officer for a ceremonial duty. Only Jake knew how much weight the dog carried in this case, both literally and legally. The lobby was already buzzing with activity. Executives in tailored suits checking their watches, assistants balancing trays of coffee, the faint whir of the security gates as ID badges were swiped. Jake noted how a few heads turned toward Ranger, some smiling faintly, others looking away too quickly. Guilt had a way of recognizing itself. Up on the 42nd floor, the boardroom was a long rectangle of glass and polished mahogany, with a panoramic view of the city's skyline. A massive table dominated the space, ringed by high-backed leather chairs. At the head sat Victoria Hale, the COO, dressed in a dove-gray skirt suit and a silk blouse the color of pale champagne. At 58, she had a regal bearing, her silver hair swept into a tight chignon, pearl earrings catching the light. Her smile, however, was the kind that never reached her eyes, cool, precise, and sharp-edged. Jake could see the flicker of irritation cross her face when she noticed him enter with Marcus Hale and Dana Collier from the FBI. "Detective Turner," she said smoothly, though Jake wasn't in detective rank. "I wasn't aware this was a law enforcement matter." "It is now," Marcus replied, setting a slim laptop case on the table. Dana began placing manila folders in front of each board member. Victoria's gaze shifted to Ranger, and for just a second, her posture stiffened. "And the dog?" she asked, the faintest quiver in her voice. Jake kept his tone even. "This is Ranger. He belonged to Janet Miller." Several board members exchanged puzzled glances, but Victoria's eyes narrowed. Jake took the seat nearest to the end of the table, unclipping Ranger's lead so he could sit beside him. When the meeting was called to order, Victoria launched into a polished presentation about strategic growth opportunities and shareholder value. Jake let her speak for a few minutes before Marcus quietly closed his laptop and said, "We'll have to interrupt you there, Ms. Hale. There are matters more urgent than projected quarterly gains." Dana tapped a key, and the large wall screen lit up with a paused video frame, the grainy footage from the loading dock. She hit play. Ranger appeared on screen, younger and healthier looking, trotting out of the service elevator with Janet Miller's backpack. "This is from the night Ms. Miller disappeared," Dana said. "The same night internal cameras on the executive floor went dark for 32 minutes. That backpack contained this." She held up the spiral notebook encased in evidence plastic. Detailed records of Ms. Hale's meetings with known members of an international financial crime syndicate. One of the board members, a heavy-set man with a florid complexion, muttered, "Jesus Christ!" Victoria's smile tightened. "This is absurd. Anyone could have written that. You have no proof it's authentic." Jake leaned forward. "We do. The notes match meeting times on your official calendar, and the microchip embedded in Ranger confirms he was registered to Ms. Miller through Iron Shield Protective Services. The registry lists her as his handler of record until both were listed as deceased within days of that night." Marcus added, "We also have recordings from secure lines captured legally with court orders of you discussing offshore accounts, laundering funds through shell companies, and threatening to dispose of a witness." The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system. Victoria's face paled, then flushed. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped. The double doors opened, and 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered. One of them, a tall woman with a severe black bob and a badge clipped to her belt, said clearly, "Victoria Hale, you are under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder of a federal witness." As they approached, Victoria backed away from the table. "Do you have any idea who I am? I built this company." Ranger stood, muscles taut, and gave a deep, echoing bark that seemed to freeze the air in the room. The sound made several board members flinch. Victoria stopped mid-protest, eyes flicking to the dog as if he were a ghost come to settle a score. Handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The agents led her toward the door, her heels striking the polished floor with sharp, defiant beats. Jake watched her go, feeling no triumph, only the sense that a long-delayed balance had finally begun to right itself. Marcus turned to the board members. "We'll need your cooperation moving forward. This investigation doesn't end here." As the FBI gathered the evidence, Ranger settled back at Jake's side, tail thumping once against the carpet as if to mark the moment. The first time Jake saw Janet Miller again, she was sitting in a recovery ward at Bellevue Hospital, a pale shaft of winter sunlight spilling across her bed. She looked smaller than in her security badge photo, her frame lean from months of deprivation, but her eyes, deep brown, alert, had lost none of their clarity. Her dark hair was cropped short now, uneven at the edges, and there were faint lines of strain around her mouth. Ranger was the first to move. The moment Jake opened the door, the German Shepherd padded forward, nails clicking softly on the linoleum. Janet's head snapped up, disbelief flooding her face. "Ranger?" Her voice cracked on the second syllable. The dog closed the distance in 3 strides, pressing his head into her lap with a low whine that Jake had never heard from him before. Janet buried her fingers in his fur, tears slipping down her cheeks as she murmured his name over and over. Jake stayed by the door, giving them the moment they deserved. When she finally looked up at him, her voice was steadier. "They told me you found him." "He found me," Jake said simply, "and he led me to the proof we needed." Over the next week, Janet's strength began to return. The FBI kept agents posted outside her door, and Dana Collier visited daily to update her on the case against Victoria Hale. Janet told them about the night she disappeared, how she'd hidden the notebook in Ranger's backpack when she realized her life was in danger, trusting him to get it out. One afternoon, as Jake prepared to leave, Janet rested a hand on Ranger's back. "He's yours now," she said. "I can't take him away from the person he chose. Besides," her smile was faint but genuine, "he clearly works better with you." Jake felt an unexpected lump in his throat. "I'll take care of him, always." A month later, on a clear February morning, Jake signed the paperwork making Ranger an official member of the NYPD K-9 unit. The department vet estimated him at 6 years old, seasoned but still in his prime. He was issued a custom vest with K-9, Ranger, stitched across the side, though Jake still preferred him in just his sturdy leather collar when they were off duty. Life settled into a new rhythm. Ranger slept beside Jake's bed every night, his breathing a steady reassurance in the dark. In the mornings, they trained together at the department's K-9 yard, Ranger's discipline sharpening with every drill. His tracking skills proved invaluable in active cases twice in the first month. He helped locate missing persons within hours. But it wasn't just work. On Jake's days off, Ranger joined him for walks through the neighborhood. Children from the nearby apartment complex would race over when they saw the pair, and Ranger's demeanor shifted instantly tail-wagging, posture relaxed, letting small hands pat his head and tug gently at his ears. There was something healing in the way the dog navigated those moments, a creature who had seen the worst of people, still choosing to trust. On one of those afternoons, Jake spotted Walter Briggs, the homeless man from months ago, leaning against a lamppost, bundled in a new jacket. Jake learned that Walter had been connected with a veterans outreach program, partly thanks to the information Jake had passed along. Walter's grin was wide as he bent to scratch Ranger's chin. "Told you he was a smart one," he said. That night, back home, Jake sat on the couch with Ranger stretched out at his feet. He thought about the months past, the rain-soaked night they'd met, the dark tunnel, the tension of the boardroom, and Janet's tears in that hospital room. The job had a way of wearing down a man's belief in what he was doing, but Ranger had given him something back, proof that persistence mattered, that loyalty could survive anything. Before turning in, Jake glanced down. "Come on, partner. Bedtime." Ranger rose and followed, leaping lightly onto his blanket at the foot of the bed. As Jake switched off the light, the city's hum softened to a distant lull. Somewhere outside, the world was still full of trouble, but here, in this small space, there was safety, purpose, and the quiet bond between a man and the dog who had chosen him. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. They come quietly, in the shape of a loyal friend, a second chance, or the courage to keep going when the road feels too long. Jake thought he was saving a stray dog, but in truth, God had sent Ranger to save him, to restore his faith, guide him to justice, and remind him that love and loyalty are divine gifts. In our daily lives, we may overlook these small miracles, a kind word, a helping hand, a moment of protection we didn't expect. But every act of goodness is a thread in God's greater plan, weaving us closer to the people and the purpose He has chosen for us. If this story touched your heart, share it with others so they too can see how God works in mysterious and beautiful ways. Leave a comment with Amen if you believe God can use even the smallest moments to change a life. And remember to like, comment, and subscribe so more people can hear stories of hope, love, and faith. May God bless you and protect you always. Amen.